Hi, my name is Yahel. I'm a medical intern studying under the guidance of Professor Schoenfeld in the Davidovich Center for Autoimmune Diseases. And today I'll present to you our novel theory regarding the role of human papillomavirus, HPV, in the development of systemic lupus erythematosus. So in this presentation, I will address the significant association between HPV and lupus patients. I will describe a plausible mechanism that may link the two, as per the requirements of Professor Rose described by Dr. Otad. And I will raise some possible repercussions on common medical practice, and finally offer some potential solutions. So the first pillar of our theory rests, the first pillar of our theory rests in the increased association between HPV and lupus patients. And one noteworthy study in this aspect examined 173 lupus patients and compared them to 217 healthy controls. The presence of HPV assessed by PCR was reported in 20% of the patients compared to only 7% of the controls. And this finding becomes even more striking when taking into account classical risk factors for HPV infection, such as multiple sexual partners and an early age of sexual activity. The patients in this study actually presented with a later age of sexual debut and a lower number of lifetime sexual partners. So this is rather striking. But a possible explanation for this could be the use of immunosuppressive therapy among the patients, which might predispose them for infection. And indeed, immunosuppressive therapy was correlated with an increased infection rate among the patients. However, when comparing the group with mild or no immunosuppressive therapy to the controls, an increased prevalence was still observed. A similar study, conducted 3 years later, compared 88 lupus patients to 70 healthy controls. And in this study, the risk for developing HPV infection the odds ratio was 7.2 among the patients, which is significantly increased. And this was despite adjustment for classical risk factors in the study. And most interestingly in this study, immunosuppressive therapy wasn't correlated with an increased rate of infection, meaning the higher rates can't be attributed to the immunosuppressive drugs. So this study, along with several others, imply that there's an increased rate of HPV infection among lupus patients. And in light of the known role of the virus in the development of cervical malignancy, we were wondering, do lupus patients present with more cervical cancer? And the question becomes even more intriguing when considering the notion some rheumatologists have that lupus patients actually present with less cancer. This is an editorial by Professor Graham Hughes, who I believe will be attending this Congress and who originally described antiphospholipid syndrome. And in this editorial, Professor Hughes describes his notion that lupus patients are actually protected from cancer. And indeed, certain cancers are less frequent among lupus patients. However, they present with higher rates of cervical malignancies. And these are just a few examples reporting a decreased risk of certain non-hematological malignancies, along with an increased risk for cervical dysplasia, an increased risk for cervical carcinoma in situ, and an axis of cervical cancer, all among lupus patients. So it seems lupus patients present with more HPV infection, and accordingly, they present with a higher rate of cervical dysplasia and malignancy. Then the relationship between HPV and lupus is no doubt of clinical significance. However, we were wondering, could it be a relationship of cause and effect? Might it be that the increased prevalence of HPV infection in these patients is due to a role of the virus in the development of the disease? And before I address this question directly, I'd like to ask one more fundamental, and that is, do we know of any infectious agents involved in the development of autoimmunity? And the answer, of course, is yes. Several infectious agents were shown to contribute to the development of autoimmunity, and specifically lupus. The most notorious ones are probably cytomegalovirus, CMV, and Epstein-Barr virus, EBV. And I'd like to focus for a minute on EBV, Epstein-Barr virus, for its remarkable analogy to HPV, human papillomavirus. So both are viral pathogens, both extremely prevalent in the general population. Both were shown to be associated with certain malignancies. And most interestingly, EBV is considered to be involved in the pathogenesis of lupus, and we believe HPV may exert a similar effect. And the involvement of EBV in the development of lupus was initially suspected based on increased association between EBV carriage and lupus development. Further studies showed that animals injected with EBV components develop lupus-like autoantibodies and lupus-like symptoms. And finally, molecular studies showed significant similarity between EBV components and human proteins related to lupus. So these findings all brought researchers to believe that EBV may contribute to the development of lupus through a mechanism commonly referred to as molecular mimicry, or more accurately perhaps, molecular homology. And the first description of molecular homology dates back to 1962, when Dr. Melvin Kaplan reported of immunoglobulin deposits in the cardiac sample, in a pathological cardiac sample of his patient. And this patient was an 11-year-old child who died of heart failure, and he was, of course, suffering from rheumatic fever, which may be viewed as a prototype of molecular homology. And in this situation, briefly, what happens is exposure of the immune system to pathogenic elements bearing similarity to human proteins. In the case of rheumatic fever, we're talking about group A streptococcal antigens, which are similar to cardiac muscle. And in this situation, the action of the immune system against these foreign elements may inadvertently harm the self proteins, leading to the common catchphrase talking about a sore throat that leads to a broken heart. And since this is an accepted mechanism in lupus induction by EBV, we were hoping to apply a similar hypothesis to the relationship between HPV and lupus. And the first question to be asked was, is there at all similarity in the molecular level between HPV proteins and human proteins? And the answer, as you may already guess, is yes. These are just a few examples reporting the vast overlap between HPV peptides and human peptides, yet we were looking for a more accurate proof of concept. So we turned to Professor Daria Kanduk, who is a bioinformatics analyst and expert analysis, and responsible for all of these publications. And we asked Professor Kanduk to examine for us HPV peptides, and specifically peptides from the 9 strains included in current vaccines. And we asked her to compare these peptides to human proteins, which, when altered, may be associated with lupus. And we've recently published our findings, reporting of dozens of pentapeptide matches. This table provides just 2 small examples, and these peptides from HPV on the left are also present in complement components, which are classically dysregulated in lupus patients. And this peptide on the left is also present on receptors of natural killer cells, which are dysfunctional among lupus patients. So these all led us to believe that HPV may contribute to the development of lupus through a mechanism of molecular homology. However, one may ask, since HPV is the most widespread sexually transmitted disease in the world today, if it causes lupus, how is it that not more people are sick? And the answer to this question lies in the concept of the mosaic of autoimmunity, which has been mentioned before me. And the mosaic of autoimmunity describes autoimmune diseases as complex processes, which, like a mosaic, are shaped by a combination of aggravating and attenuating factors. And these can be environmental, nutritional, hormonal, and perhaps most important, genetic factors. In fact, one prominent example of such a genetic factor, which was again already brought out today, is in the HLA-DRB1 gene. Certain alleles of these genes have been shown to carry susceptibility to lupus. So, in order for a person to develop an autoimmune disease or lupus, a complex set of conditions should exist. And naturally, there is more than one right possible set. We suggest that the existence of genetic predisposition combined with exposure to HPV may compile together one of the possible immune mosaics resulting in the development of lupus. Now, this of course applies to exposure to HPV through spontaneous infection. However, it also applies to exposure to HPV via the HPV vaccines. And this is a good time for a short personal confession. This is my son, Ethan. He's extremely cute, if you're wondering. He's almost 2 years old. And those of you who can read Hebrew may note that he's fully vaccinated according to our national vaccination program. So I've brought this picture, first of all, because he's extremely cute, but mainly just to emphasize that we are not anti-vaccines. And in fact, I apply my strong belief in the importance of vaccines on my own son. However, in light of the possible repercussions I've raised for the HPV vaccines, I now have to address them. So there are currently 3 HPV vaccines in common practice: the Cervarix, which is bivalent, the Gardasil, which is quadrivalent, and the new nonavalent vaccine. All are considered to provide long-lasting protection against HPV infection and the development of pre-malignant lesions. However, reports have been accumulating on post-vaccination diverse autoimmune phenomena, and specifically reports of SLE following vaccination. And some of these were already mentioned by my colleagues, but I'd like to present some additional ones. And these are 2 case series, one of 3 patients and one of 6 patients, and 1 case report. All of these developed lupus promptly after being vaccinated. And these reports led us to search VAERS, the U.S. National Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System database. And we searched for reports of autoimmunity, and specifically lupus, following HPV vaccines. 367 reports were filed. Now, even considering the obvious limitations of such a database, this is still a rather staggering number. However, this may be viewed simply as an alarmingly large case series. So one study, already mentioned again, conducted a case control assessment of the VAERS database, comparing reports of lupus development following HPV vaccines to reports of lupus following any other vaccine. And the authors reported an odds ratio of 7.6 for developing lupus following HPV vaccinations compared to other vaccines. Finally, this meta-analysis designed to assess the risk for developing lupus and rheumatic arthritis following vaccinations assessed 12 studies regarding lupus, and the authors again reported a significant risk for developing lupus following vaccination. So these all present preliminary data regarding the relationship between HPV vaccines and lupus, and no doubt further research is necessary. However, there seems to be substantial evidence for a link between the two. The question is, what should be done at this point? And we have 2 suggestions. The first one is to vaccinate wisely, namely apply careful consideration, taking into account the risks entailed versus the potential benefits when approaching vaccination of populations at risk for autoimmunity. And who are these populations at risk for autoimmunity? This question has already been raised in this forum, and it's an excellent question. So 4 parameters have been suggested, and Dr. Watad already addressed a few of them, so I'll focus on additional ones. And these are people who developed post-vaccination autoimmune phenomena, people with a personal history of autoimmunity, people with a history of allergic reactions, and specifically allergic reactions following vaccinations, and finally, people with a predisposition for autoimmunity, and this could be through a significant family history of autoimmunity, through a genetic profile if it was done, or through the presence of autoantibodies, which can be detected in routine screening. So these are all populations we need to keep in mind when approaching vaccination. And our next suggestion might be a little more complex to carry out. However, it holds a potential for a more substantial solution. And that is changing the vaccines. Instead of using the current vaccines, which utilize peptides bearing significant similarity to human proteins, we suggest developing new vaccines based on unique viral peptides, which carry no similarity to the human proteome. In this manner, we may conserve the immunogenicity of the vaccine, along with substantially reducing the risk for immune cross-reactivity and autoimmunity. This graph illustrates the idea. These are peptides from the HPV-L1 protein, and the black bars indicate peptides which are abundant in the human proteome, while the circled areas indicate unique viral peptides which may serve to create a safer vaccine. So, in summation, we know that HPV has an increased prevalence among lupus patients, and we've also shown that there's a significant similarity or vast overlap between HPV peptides and human peptides which may be associated with lupus. We believe this data, along with parallel models, contributes to our hypothesis that HPV may lead to the development of lupus in at-risk individuals through a mechanism of molecular homology. we suggest applying careful consideration when approaching vaccines among populations at risk. And finally, we offer that developing new vaccines based on unique viral peptides may serve to reduce the immunogenicity and autoimmunity following vaccination.
Excellent presentation. Paper is open for discussion.
I'm Manuel Martinez Labrin from Mexico, and I thank you for your excellent presentation. My question is, do we have information on the development of anti-nuclear antibodies or lupus-specific antibodies after HPV vaccination?
So first of all, I'd like to say I've read your research and I'm a fan, but so I'm honored to be answering questions. But in regards with your specific question, unfortunately, I don't know of any research done assessing development of anti-nuclear antibodies or double-stranded DNA antibodies following vaccination. And the reason why could be that it's a rather explosive subject to research, and I think many people avoid researching the adverse events of the HPV vaccines. I think it's safe to say in this auditorium. So that's maybe why.
Hi, I'm Michin Robinson from the United States. I have two questions. The first one is the statement that you refer to the association between HPV vaccine and lupus, pretty strong. So I just like to know the timeline of the development, if there's any evidence that there was associated with the development of lupus. That's the first question.
Okay, so with regards to your first question, it's a little tricky because, you know, there have been research, there have been safety studies following HPV vaccines that didn't show an increased incidence of lupus following vaccination. And this could be raised as the cons case against this relationship. The problem is that lupus is not like, I don't know, developing a cold. And sometimes it takes time to diagnose the disease, and it takes time to understand that the initial symptoms eventually belong to an autoimmune disease. And I think if you would ask Professor Schoenfeld, he would say that post-vaccination autoimmune phenomena may develop even years after the vaccine because they ignite complex processes in our immune system. But most of the studies done refer to a period of up to 180 days following vaccination. So there aren't, except for the analysis of VAERS, which I presented, there aren't any prospective studies reporting increased rates of lupus following HPV vaccine. So I don't have, unfortunately, an answer to your question, but it would be very complex to explore because of the nature of diagnosing lupus.
Yeah, that's exactly why I was asking, because the development of the disease itself, it took a long time and even to diagnose. So to actually link to HPV when they started, and it's not easy. So the second question, because you mentioned that obviously we all know there's a genetic predisposition. So in the meta-analysis, was there an evidence of the prevalence of the population? For example, some of the population, they have a more higher risk of genetic predisposition versus other population, there's a lower risk of that, right? So if you look at the different population, would the statement of HPV associated with lupus development still stand?
So again, an excellent question. I'd like to also say, with regards to your first question, that it relates to the question of Professor Martinez-Levin regarding antibody development, because we know antibodies come a lot before the clinical manifestation. And since not even this was done, it's really hard to say when the disease itself expresses. And with regards to the populations explored, this is one of the greatest criticisms against the safety studies of HPV vaccines, that there was no profiling, let alone genetic profiling, but even more simple characteristics of the populations explored. So unfortunately, again, I don't have a good answer for you, but it wasn't examined. That is the answer, I think.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation too. Thank you.
Hello. Excellent presentation. Thank you. My name is Tom O'Brien from California. In your summary, you referenced 4 considerations for caution in application of vaccines. One of them was presence of autoantibodies. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
I'm not sure in what way you mean to, but I know...
What type of autoantibodies?
Oh, what type of antibodies? So I think, first of all, anti-nuclear antibodies, and no doubt double-stranded DNA antibodies, which basically predict the development of lupus in the future. And I know of people who walk around with these antibodies and no label of having been sick with lupus. These are people who I assume are very likely to develop lupus following vaccination. But concrete scientific answer to your question is a little complex to provide since it wasn't explored. So these would be my first culprits that I would avoid of.
That's a good point. Thank you.
Hi, Stan Nades, also California. You've hypothesized that there is homology between vaccine peptides and native peptides. Yet the sine qua non for lupus or antibodies to double-stranded DNA. And we know that double-stranded DNA is a very poor immunogen. So within your hypothesized model, how would you develop antibodies to double-stranded DNA, characteristic of lupus, from exposure to a peptide vaccine?
That's a very complex question to answer, but I think what we've provided here is a very basic, very initial proof of concept. We're now currently experimenting in the Zabladovich Center of Autoimmune Diseases in injecting HPV peptides to NZB mice, and we hope to prove that these develop double-stranded DNA antibodies. And it was shown, for example, in the relationship between EBV and lupus, that EBV component, once injected to rabbits and mice, they develop double-stranded DNA antibodies. And some of these studies report and even demonstrate epitope spreading with, for example, with regards, we're talking about EBV, to the Smith antigen that bears similarity, and then there's epitope spreading and non-specific antibody production. But it's too early for me to answer this with regards to HPV, since we haven't gotten to explore it yet.
And these would be NZB mice that are prone to develop.
In what we're experimenting, yes, exactly. We're starting with NZB, and it's exactly like we're talking about in the population. I don't think that just any individual might develop lupus following HPV vaccines. We're talking about a risk for individuals with a predisposition, for individuals with genetic risk, with a certain profile that puts them in danger for developing this disease to begin with.
Thank you.
It's going to sound like a very simple question. So why is HPV an adjuvanted vaccine?
Why is HPV an adjuvant? As opposed to being non-adjuvanted? Well, that's actually a simple question, because you see that when you examine individuals following HPV infection, their titers of HPV antibodies, their serological profiles are very low. This is a vaccine that on itself isn't good at, it's good at immune stealth. It's not good at developing a storm of immunogenicity and autoimmunity. And this may be why the infection in genetically prone disposition, genetically prone individuals leads to the development of lupus, possibly, but vaccines might be even more risky because they add an element that isn't there in the infection itself, and that is the adjuvant, which helps stimulate the immune system.
A question extending a bit, the same point. Did you make discrimination between Cervarix, which is adjuvanted with aluminum hydroxide, and Gardasil, which is adjuvanted with another type of aluminum adjuvant, which is a novel generation aluminum adjuvant that appears to be more potent. Did you make a difference between the two?
Well, the difference was made. It's something that we observed when reviewing the data, that yes, definitely the Gardasil shows higher rates of, even reports in VAERS are much more abundant when examining the Gardasil compared to the Cervarix. Yes.
Thank you.